All right, next chapter. Chapter 3, the titles of the Gospels. I don't think I'm going to read much more word for word, but I'm just going to try to hit on the high points and I guess my thoughts about them. So basically, he's making an argument that there's two ways to figure out who wrote a book. And he uses the example of Pope Benedict the 16th and his 3-volume work, Jesus of Nazareth. How do we know who wrote it? First, you can look inside the book for internal evidence, basically a foreword or a preface or an afterword, to see if there's any autobiographical information indicating how the book came to be. But nevertheless, sometimes there are reasons to doubt that. After all, books can be forged. This is true in ancient times as well as our own. So you can also use external evidence. In the case of Pope Benedict, we could consult his contemporaries, people who knew him, and ask if he wrote the book. Do they think it's correctly attributed to him? Was it published during his lifetime? Did he authorize its publication? If you did this, you would discover the internal and the external evidence corroborate each other. Blah, blah, blah. These very same principles work when you're investigating the authorship of the 4 Gospels, and any other ancient book for that matter. I love that he does tie it back to that. This type of reasoning can be used on any work. Okay, we're going to follow some rules for exploring the authorship of the 4 Bibles. First, we'll look at clues from inside the manuscripts. Then we'll look at clues from the ancient Christian writers living closest to Jesus, closest to the time of Jesus himself, which would be external evidence. The goal would be to ask the question, if the Gospels were not originally anonymous, then whom does the internal and external evidence point? We begin with the most explicit internal evidence of all, the titles. Matthew, the tax collector and apostle. As we saw in the last chapter, every ancient manuscript we possess of the book of Matthew, the first book of the New Testament, bears the title, The Gospel According to Matthew. But who is Matthew? The Gospel contains some further evidence that helps us to identify the person to whom the book is attributed. First, it tells us how Jesus calls Matthew to leave behind his life as a tax collector and become one of his followers. Oh, by the way, if any of y'all are tax collectors, you should totally quit and just follow me around. Okay. As Jesus passed on from there, he saw a man called Matthew sitting at the tax office, and he said to him, "Follow me." And he rose and followed him. That was easy. Second, the Gospel also tells us that Matthew was later chosen by Jesus to be one of the inner circle of the 12 disciples. Blah, blah, blah. So in terms of internal evidence, this is pretty much all we get. When combined with the evidence of the title, we can conclude that the Gospel is being attributed to Matthew, the former tax collector, who at some point during Jesus' public ministry became one of the 12 disciples. Notice something very interesting. It's always weird how it's always 12, isn't it? Like, nobody else hung out with him ever? Alright. Notice something very intriguing about this internal evidence. The first gospel is attributed to the only one of Jesus' apostles who would likely have been literate. Okay, we're going to see how that applies to the next book, which they attribute it to another disciple who I guess isn't literate. The reason that this is significant is that some scholars claim that the Gospels couldn't have been written by any of Jesus' disciples because they were fishermen and therefore probably illiterate. Consider the words of Ehrman. Blah, blah, blah. On the basis of their illiteracy, the same scholar goes on to claim that even if the original apostles had been forward-looking, they would not have been able to write a gospel. Okay. Basically, Matthew is probably the only literate one, and it's him that we attribute this gospel to. Blah, blah, blah. Basically, now it's my question of, well, why didn't, if the apostles knew Jesus was so important, why didn't they take some notes while he was alive? We know that other ancient students did. And if it did occur to them, blah, 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 who would they have selected? Oh, the tax collector. I don't know. Again, it doesn't matter to me whether or not Matthew wrote the book of Matthew. That doesn't make it any more likely to be true. So, still kind of straw manning the skeptic's position.